we've been trying to do chronologically. I've been trying to figure out the whole timeline of, we'll end up going through the book of John, but I also wanted to reference all the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Trying to put the timeline together has been a nightmare. Just when I think I figured it out, I haven't. So if you go home and have questions, you figure it out and come back and tell me, right? But I'm going to do my best. Mark 16, I spoke last week about the first 4 verses, so I'm not going to go much over them, but I will read them so we give a bit of context. Remember, we're just trying to follow Jesus to the cross from John 20 and using all the other. So what I've done is the passage in John 10, I'm going to go back, do Matthew, Mark, Luke, then do John, and then go and keep going through the Gospels, because every Gospel gives you a bit more information. And if you read all of the Gospels, you start to put everything together. Some Gospels leave some things out and you wouldn't know. All right, Mark 16, I'm going to read verse 1 through 4, and then I'll start talking at verse 5. Saturday evening, when the Sabbath ended, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome went out and purchased burial spices so they could anoint Jesus' body. Very early on Sunday morning, just at sunrise, they went to the tomb. On the way there, they were asking each other, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb? But as they arrived, they looked up and saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled aside. What we discovered last week is that there was an earthquake, then an angel rolled the stone aside, and he sits on it when he meets these other ladies. And what we spoke about was how amazing they were in some aspects. So these women had been watching at the crucifixion. Joseph of Arimathea buries Jesus. They put a stone across, and Joseph of Arimathea goes home, and these women linger, and they see Jesus is dead. They see it's in their eyesight, it's over. And yet, so they wait through the Sabbath, and then they come to anoint his body so it wouldn't smell and all these things. And we spoke about how amazing it was that they were willing to go to the tomb and just trust that somehow they could get in. But the mistake they made was that they didn't ever fully really understand and compute what Jesus had told them. Jesus has always said, I'll be killed, I'll be betrayed, I'll be taken. But the great promise was a resurrection. He keeps telling them, but in what? But in 3 days, I'll come back, I'll rise again. If they had really understood that and believed that, there's no point, there's no need to anoint the body. He's not going to be there. He's not going to be there long. Don't worry about it. There's a worshipful aspect to this, but they didn't. The problem was, and we'll learn Peter, John, the disciples, even when the resurrection happened, a lot of them had problems. Even when they saw Jesus, or heard testimony about Jesus, they had some real strong problems. And when I think about that, disciples who loved Jesus, Judas didn't, but the rest of them loved him. The rest of the 11 disciples truly loved Jesus. They gave up everything for him. I mean, if we were to put our lives against their lives, they'd win. Right? I mean, if we were trying to win a contest of Christian of the Year, they'd be hard to beat. They were men who were devoted, who were all martyred, basically. John outlives them at Patmos. He's thrown into a vat of oil and somehow survives. He had a nasty time of it. A lot of the rest are martyred. And these amazing men, and yet they struggled. And they lived with Jesus. They walked with him. They talked with him. There's no telling what happened in those 3 and a bit years that he was with them. And they still struggled. So that tells you can never have enough, right? And remember, even in the 40 days that he appeared to them after he had died, he appeared to them to prove that he was actually still alive. Like part of his remit in the 40 days was to prove that he was there. So what I'm getting at is this, that if we take for granted coming, serving, praying, giving, discipleship, mentoring, if they had a hard time with spiritual issues, what do you think we'll have? I mean, if living with Jesus for 3 years and listening to him teach, and look, this is just a highlight reel. There's no telling what he told them and what he's shown them and how many miracles he did. And yet the truth is, when push came to shove, they were weak a lot. They struggled. They were hurting. And so it makes you realize how much we really need to emphasize mentoring and discipleship and teaching and preaching and listening and serving, everything we can do to get to know God, because that's how you're going to succeed. Look at verse 5. We talked about the rest of it last week, but verse 5, some of it is a rehash, and that's what happens in the gospel. There'll be a repeat, but they'll add tidbits of information. When they entered the tomb, this is everyone but Mary Magdalene, they entered the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a white robe, an angel sitting on the right side. The women were shocked. The meaning of that word literally means they were paralyzed with fear. When it says shocked, they weren't just like, "Oh, that scared me." They were like done in with fear. There was all kinds. You see, here again, if we don't put in, this is what we were talking about last week. The Bible tells us how to have peace. How do we have peace? He tells us in Philippians, right? Make your requests be known. Give him thanks. Thank him for what he's done. It's what it says. And so when you don't have peace, what do you think's happened? If you're not having peace as a believer, it's either not true or you're not following the prescription, right? Be thankful at all times. There's lots of... What I'm getting at is this, again, they never took the reality of the resurrection and applied it to their life. They shouldn't have been shocked. They should have been thrilled. This was an amazing moment. This proved everything they had hoped for. We spoke last week. They would have been thrilled to see a dead body, but a dead Jesus. If Jesus was dead in a tomb, that's not a good thing for anybody. If we could go on a holy pilgrimage and find Jesus in the tomb, that's a nightmare, not something good. They didn't want him to be in there, but they did because they were scared. They were afraid. And notice what they keep saying. We don't know what they've done with his body. They think someone's stolen his body. Look at what it says. The women were shocked, but the angel said, "Don't be alarmed. You are looking," look, even the angels know exactly. God has told them, "You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was" what? Yeah, he was crucified, but he isn't here. He is risen from what? He's risen from the dead. This should be a no-brainer. This is what he's told. This is not the first time he's told you this. Look, this is where they laid his body. We find out that he's wrapped up the cloth and put the napkin and all of that stuff. This is where his body laid. And so, robbers, why would robbers take his body and leave that like that? Like, none of it makes sense. Any scenario that you put like, well, it wasn't resurrection, it was something else, just doesn't fit. I mean, what scenario makes sense? If Jesus isn't risen from the dead, then what in the world happened? I mean, some of them were claiming that the disciples stole the body. What in the world was Peter going to do with a dead body? And if he did take Jesus, why did he wrap it, do all that, put that to the side, and just carry it? Where was he going? None of it makes sense. But he says he's risen from the dead. This is where they laid his body. It must have been a surreal moment. Jesus had been there. His body had been there. Now go and tell the disciples. This was their mandate, and this is what we spoke about last week. That when God does something, that when God is working in the women, God knows that he has to have witnesses. He's going to have a bunch of witnesses. He shows up to 500 people at one time, Jesus does, because he has to authenticate the resurrection. If nobody sees Jesus alive, that's going to be problematic. I mean, they're struggling now. Imagine if he is risen from the dead. This is where they laid his body. Now go and tell who? Go and tell his disciples. Because what is the one thing the disciples need to know? The disciples need to know the same thing. The disciples need to know that he's risen. And this is a beautiful thing. It says including who? Including who? Why Peter? Why call out Peter? Why say including Peter? What'd you say? That's part of it. He had betrayed him, and there's that kind of encouragement and love. And why else? That's part of it. It's a kind of restoration, a kind of, hey, Peter. Imagine if they go and tell him, hey, he especially wanted us to tell you. That is part of that. But why else would it be? What has to be the rock on which they're standing? It's the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus, right? Who's going to lead the church? If Peter is off on that, he will meet Peter on his own. Peter had to understand completely the resurrection, because if Peter's wobbly on that, and Peter doesn't even get it, for a long time Peter doesn't get it. But he calls out Peter, and he says, go and tell, including Peter, and this is the promise. And in John 20, we'll see it fulfilled. I think it's John 20. Let me see. John 21, actually. Look at what Jesus promises. Because, again, this is how God works. God wants to walk you by faith. And so he tells you things that are going to require you to what? They're not seeing him right now. They will see him. And by Sunday night, a lot of people have seen him. But he tells them, go and tell his disciples, including Peter, that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. Here's the promise of God. You will physically see him. Where? In Galilee. God has just made a promise through an angel that Jesus is going to be in Galilee. If Jesus doesn't show up to Galilee, the whole thing is over. It's one of those things. They're going to meet Jesus, but it's one of those things that, look, I'm telling you, I'll meet you in Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you before what? This is what we were talking about last week. We're in Mark 16, verse 7. You will see him there, just as he told you before he died. This is our problem, and this is what we spoke about last week. Lots of times we're asking for new revelation. We're asking for understanding. We're asking for wisdom that he's already given us. For instance, the disciples, these ladies, whoever you want to make it, did they need any more information than what they had already received? To understand the resurrection, did they need anything else? They didn't. He kept telling them, I'm coming back. He said, I'll meet you in Galilee before he died. He's given them all this information. And what we do is, Lord, I need to know. And he's already either told us, or it's what? It's in here. That's why we need to read this book, so we will understand. So that we will be able to know what he said, to know what he's told us. And look, this changes, but look at verse 8. The women fled from the tomb. They were trembling. They were bewildered. This is exactly what the devil wants. The greatest hope of the Christian faith is the resurrection of Jesus. Without it, nothing works. The resurrection of Jesus is absolutely crucial to what? To everything. If the devil can bring fear and trembling and bewilderment to the resurrection, where's he got you? Right where he wants you. I mean, if we are scared or unexcited or unmoved by the cross, what now? He's got these women, and again, I get it. I'm not saying the resurrection isn't a normal thing. And we don't know how we would react if, like, I'm glad it's not a story of Phil in here and who knows what I would have done. But what I'm saying is the trap is that they had been told and told and told and told. And yet when push came to shove, God had prepared. Here's what I'm trying to tell you. God has prepared you for what's ahead. God foreknows everything. God, by his Spirit, by his word, by people, by the sermons, by intervention, God is preparing you. Do you think God lets you just walk into like arrows? God sees what's ahead. You think God's the type of God that doesn't warn you, that doesn't put any fences up and just lets you fall off a cliff? He knows what's coming. But how he prevents it is he shows you who he is. He gives you his word. He makes promises. Sometimes you'll know what he's telling you. You'll be reading. You'll be praying. He's teaching you principles because he knows what's coming. And again, we think that we can just haphazardly walk through life and he's somehow going to just have a net there for us. What I'm telling you is God prepared. He had prepared every one of his disciples for this moment. Remember what he told Peter, the devil is wanting to sift you. But I've prayed for you. Go and, when all of this is, go and strengthen your brothers. And it's a sad kind of reality that that should have been their sweetest moment. Now they will see Jesus, and that's going to be sweet. But how much sweeter is it to believe it because he said it rather than what you've seen? It's a Thomas thing all over again. These women would have got more credit for celebrating the resurrection without seeing it is better than celebrating because you've seen it. Does that make sense? They're both good. But if you can celebrate if we had to see Jesus, we're all struggling. We have to believe in I have no proof of the resurrection outside of faith. I've never seen Jesus. Never have. But I believe he's alive. And part of that is the Holy Spirit's inside, and he's our guarantor. The women flee. They're trembling. They're bewildered. And they said nothing to anyone. This is the same old trap. This is why we don't evangelize properly. This is why we don't do what we need to do. Why? And look at what he says. And now this changes. They don't stay like this, thank God. They said nothing to anyone because they were too what? Too afraid, too frightened. How many times could we admit to ourselves, I should have done that, but I was too scared? I should have had this moment to tell them about Jesus, but and listen, we can come up, I do, you can come up with the most spiritual reasons why I couldn't witness to them right now. But if the truth be known, lots of times we're scared. And what are we scared of? Let's just be honest a minute. We're trying not to get your face on the camera. All right. When we are meant to be talking about God, even if it's just to each other, what stops us? What things frighten us from actually saying what we should be saying? Rejection. That's a big one. What'd you say? How they gonna react to it? So rejection, reaction. Hey, that's a sermon, 2 hours. If we get a few more, I could preach it. All right. What? Yeah. Some of it is if we don't do it, we never get good at it, and that's the beauty of it. You can fumble your way through it, and Jesus can still use you. So, but I don't know if that's a good reason or we ask. That's a reason, but it's kind of an excuse. But it's true. It's what we say. What else? Why else don't we tell? This is hot news. This is the best news ever. Jesus. Remember, these women have been entranced with Jesus. They've followed him. They've paid for him. They've worshipped him. They can't stop thinking about Jesus, even when he's dead. They're going to his tomb. These are infatuated with Jesus in the right sense. And yet, there's this kind of stop. And you think about how much have we missed in our lives because in the end, we were just too scared. We hear people say, I don't want to get to the end of my life and have regrets. I think the biggest regrets we'll have is I let the devil scare me into not doing what I should have been doing. I should have said. I should have told them. I should have whatever. Now, again, this changes. Look at verse 14 of Mark 16. I think this is when he appears to Thomas, verse 14. Still later, he appeared to the 11 disciples as they were eating together. Remember, the first time Thomas is missing, Judas has killed himself, so we're down to 11. But the first time Thomas wasn't there, he appeared to the 11 as they were eating together. He rebuked them for their stubborn unbelief. Jesus appears to his 11 men, those 11 disciples. And they're eating together. And instead of coming and saying, see what you want in that moment is Jesus to say what? When Jesus has given you a test, what do you want him to say? Well done, good and faithful servant. When Jesus gives us a test, a trial to go through, he doesn't tempt us, but he can try us. He can test us. What you want to be able to say is by your grace. It's never I did it. That's never the case. But sometimes it needs to be, God, by your grace, I stood in the day of battle. I honored you. I did what you wanted me to do. And yet, he doesn't just say the disciples were struggling about the resurrection a little bit. He says he rebuked them. That's a nice way of saying he was pretty harsh with them. Not harsh in the wrong sense, but he wasn't joking around. For their stubborn unbelief, because they refused to believe. Here's what Jesus was getting onto them about. They had a stubborn unbelief. What is stubbornness? And what is stubborn unbelief? Stubborn unbelief is refusing to change your mind, even in the face of what? I mean, it's like Paul says to the Galatians, I can't believe where you're at. When I was with you, it's like you saw Jesus on the cross yourself. You were so there. And someone has betwixt you. Someone has got to you. You believe in all of this nonsense. All of us are stubborn. All of us. Now, there may be varying degrees, but we're all stubborn at points. And if you don't think you are, ask someone that knows you. And what are we stubborn on? Most of the time, it's stubborn things that mean something to us. We're not generally stubborn over things that I don't really care about. Now, sometimes, especially men, we just like to win an argument just to argue, so that could be. But look, because they refused, God is trying to help them. God looks at the disciples, and he knows who he called. He knows their weaknesses. He knows they're a little off at times. He knew that. He knew it. When Jesus called the 12, he knew Judas was the devil. He knew. He knew Peter was Peter and John was John. And he knew. He knew. And yet he worked with them and he molds them. And there's this moment where he leaves and they have to wait. And 10 days later, the Holy Spirit comes and then they're ready. Because Jesus didn't allow them to do anything before they were indwelt. Nothing. That's how much power they had on their own. It wasn't like start the church and I'll send you help. You don't do a thing. Just sit there. You imagine how hard that was for Peter and that? Just sit there and do absolutely nothing because you're going to ruin it. If you don't even start it. Don't even start until the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And look at what he says. They refused to believe those who had seen him after he had been raised from the dead. Mary Magdalene goes to tell them. These women would eventually get over their fear and go and tell them. And in the face of all of it, the disciples are like, what? In fact, we'll read in Luke, they say this is nonsense. We talked about last week, remember when the church in Acts is praying for Peter to be released from prison. Peter gets released from prison. He knocks on the door. Rhoda says, that's Peter. I recognize his voice. And they're all like, you're crazy. I mean, how crazy is that? At a prayer meeting, you're praying, God answered it, and then everyone's like, no, that can't happen. Well, why are you praying it? What I'm telling you is this. Let's bring it here. God isn't sitting there saying, oh, watch this. Woo, they're going to. He knows what's coming. And when we mess up, it's not because he didn't train us or tell us or warn us or show us. It's because we were just absolutely stubborn. I don't know if you can look back and say there were signs. There were signs. I should have. You ever noticed that with people or with whatever? You ever had a relationship go bad and there were signs it was going bad from the beginning, but you refused to what? You refused to believe it. There's lots of things we do like, God has sent women. God has sent people. God has sent these women to tell the disciples. And I don't know if it was because they were women and it was a weird culture back there. For whatever reason, they absolutely refused. Maybe they think, you know what, I don't want to believe that he's been raised from the dead because if that's not true, then I'm devastated again. I mean, what's worse than seeing Jesus die once is believing he came back and he hasn't. He kept telling them. And God has sent people that after he had been raised from the dead, they refused to believe those who had seen him. God had actually appeared to Mary Magdalene. Jesus appears to these women later. And they go and say, hey, I've seen Jesus. And they're like, no. What I'm telling you is we do that in our life. And we've got to check our stubborn unbelief. And people say stuff sometimes, and because it's not what we think or what's comfortable to us, or we just refuse it. And God is the God who is watching you, and he sends his Spirit to help you. But he's not a robot maker either. He can overwhelm you. He can do whatever he wants. If he wants you to, he can do whatever he wants. But you know, if someone keeps warning you, don't go too close to the cliff, don't go too close to the cliff, whose fault is it? And if you look at your life, here's what I'm willing to, don't shout this out, but go back to maybe 4 or 5 of your most heinous crimes, sins. The things you don't want nobody to know about, right? I'm willing to bet you, if you really think it through, that God was all over you, showing you, speaking to you, before you ever got there. That before that moment of lust came, he'd been speaking to you. That before you got yourself in this, I think we can look back and say, you told me that, didn't you? I mean, if you want to know that God knows what he's talking about, either listen to him and do it, or don't do what he's telling you, and you'll find out he knows what he's talking about. What I'm telling you is, he knows when we're going to struggle. He knows when the devil's coming. He knows all of that. And he had let, this is what God does. He had let women, and the women see Jesus alive, not just for the women. Yes, it was for the women. But who else was it for? For everybody else, for the disciples. And this is what Jesus does. He shows something to you to help you, but it's also then got to be taken to other people. And he says you are so stubborn in your unbelief. In the face of witness, you just say, nah. We do that a lot, I think. Look at Luke chapter 24. I'm just going to read this because it's a lot of rehash of what we've talked about, but there's something I want to show you. Luke 24, verse 1. Very early on Sunday morning, the women went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. They found the stone that had been rolled away from the entrance. So they went in, but they didn't find the body of the Lord Jesus. As they stood there puzzled, 2 men suddenly appeared to them, clothed in dazzling robes. The women were terrified and bowed with their faces to the ground. And the men asked, "Why are you looking among the dead for someone who is alive?" That's a really poignant question. That really was kind of a spiritual question for them. He isn't here. He's risen from the dead. Remember what he told you back in Galilee. And this adds a little bit. What did Jesus told them? That the Son of Man must be betrayed into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and that he would what? That he would rise again on the 3rd day. So this is just a rehash. The Gospels repeat stuff. It's the same. It proves that these are 4 eyewitnesses, 4 people speaking about it that God has given. Son of Man must be betrayed into the hands of sinful men and be crucified. Well, they saw that. They saw him being betrayed. They saw sinful men crucify him. And that he would rise again on the 3rd day. Go to John chapter 20. Again, I'm trying to give you all the little bits of information from every bit of the Gospels. It's my contention that the women go to the tomb on the Sunday. Mary gets freaked out, Mary Magdalene, and she thinks, where have they put the body of Jesus? And she runs. She runs to tell Peter and John. Meanwhile, the women stay at the tomb, and that's what we just read. They encounter the angel. So what we just read is the women, not Mary Magdalene, but the others who encounter these angels, who he says, go and tell. They're frightened, they're bewildered. In John 20, verse 3, or verse 2, Mary Magdalene found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, which is John. They've taken the Lord's body out of the tomb. See, this is her problem. This is her misunderstanding. They have taken the Lord's body out the tomb. Wait, who took the Lord's body out the tomb? God did. Jesus did. She thinks the enemies have taken him. And we don't know where they've put him. We talked about that last week. This is her angst. I don't know where they've put his body. Peter and the other disciple, John, started out for the tomb. They hear this from Mary Magdalene, and it's just typical Peter. It's what? Impulsive, excited. He's just got to what? He's just got to go see it, which is kind of cool, actually, right? They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter. Apparently, John's a better runner. Peter and John are running. John goes with him. John's the beloved disciple. Peter, James is the only one missing from the inner three. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. What does John do? See, this is why it's really, really interesting. And by the way, even in this, it's no coincidence that Peter and John did this. This is all of God. It's exactly who needs to do it. It's the exact pair that need to do it. Peter and John are pretty influential characters. And God's about to do something amazing. Here's what God does. Why did they decide to run to the tomb? If you ask them, why did you run to the tomb? They're going to say what? Whatever. See, sometimes we think it's us making the decision, but guess what? This is all sovereignly ordained by God. Sometimes we'll say things like, I wanted to, or I thought it'd be a good idea. God allows you to make decisions because they're the right decisions for him. And he allows you to think you made them, because if you don't think you're making them, guess what you'll do? Sometimes if God mandated, go to the tomb now, they'd probably throw a hissy fit. So he just lets them want to go to the tomb, and there you go. I don't know if that makes sense to you, if that's ever happened to you, but God allows you to think that this is what you want and this is what is good for you, and then you realize later that wasn't me, was it? No, that wasn't you. What seems like a little kind of crazy story, like Peter and John running. Why those two? Why did only two go? There's 11 of them. Why is only two run? You can say personality, but this is God. They start out for the tomb. Remember, they're having a hard time believing it. They were both running, but the other disciple outruns Peter and reached the tomb first. Verse 5, what does John do? He stoops in, he looks in, and he saw the linen wrappings lying there. This is weird. He's seeing the same thing. There's no body. But it's all wrapped up. So again, grave robbers don't spend the time. By the way, grave robbery was a massive deal. Even the Romans, if you got caught robbing a grave, you were dead. You think the grave robbers were like, hey, let's make nice. It'd be like a burglar going in your house, wrecking the stuff, and then saying, oh, let's clean up, can we? I mean, that'd just be weird. Your burglars probably aren't going to do your dishes, right? They're just not. God's even set this sign up with the linen wrappings. But what does John do? John stoops in and he sees. But for whatever reason, he what? He can't go in. He won't go in. You think God knew that? What happens if Peter's not there? John goes home. He stoops. He sees. Something's about to change. Look at what it says. He stoops, he looks in, he saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. It'd be fascinating to ask him, why didn't you go in? Again, scared, confused, whatever. Simon Peter arrives. Do you catch this? John's made it. He stooped in. He's just standing at the tomb. All of a sudden, maybe panting, and that took you a minute. Like, where have you been? Where's your Fitbit? Like, he runs, probably tired, and Peter, being Peter, doesn't what? He doesn't like, hey, what did you find out? Oh, Peter ain't got no time for that. Peter's just that person. What does he do? He's just gone in. John must be like, I mean, if you're nervous about going in, if you're nervous about doing something, Peter's probably not the dude to go with, right? I mean, it's like, how nervous would you be to take Peter to meet your parents if you were trying to marry him? Dude, just don't say anything, please. Just keep calm. If my dad upsets you, don't bring a knife out and try and cut his ear off, right? We're going to be all right. Don't try and walk on water. You don't have to be a hero. He stooped, looked in, John did. Simon Peter arrives. Simon Peter, his old name, and went inside. And it says he also noticed the linen wrappings lying there. He ran in and then was like, oh, there's linen wrappings. While the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. Now that's a little minor information, but again, grave robbers wouldn't do that. God, do you see how many little things God has said? If you said to God, how many clues did you give them about resurrection? You think it's one? Could be 10, 20, 30, 50. There's an old tradition, I don't know if it's true or not, about you've heard about a king at a banquet that if he just left it like messy, he was coming back. At the table, if he was going to the toilet or something, the napkin, he would just let his napkin be. He'd go do what he needed to do and come back. If he was done, while the cloth that covered was folded up. So when you fold it up, that means I'm done. I'm not coming, oh. Yeah, I got it backwards, all right. All right, so my wife's giving me that look. Okay. Well, anyway, figure that out. Okay, so it's folded up. That means he's gone, right? Oh, my goodness. All right. Just erase that. We're not putting this on Facebook. I'm glad I started down there. Yeah, anyway, the napkin told Peter, good luck. It's great. All right. Let's move on. That's him trying to call me. All right. Verse 7. The cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. And the disciple who had reached the tomb first, what does John do now? What does John do now? Why does he go in? What prompted him to go in? What does that mean for you and me? Is it possible that God knew who he was going to put with you? Is it possible that God knew who you were to marry, who were your kids to be, who your church family was to be? Is it possible that he sends you out on a journey with certain people knowing exactly what you'll need? Paul and Barnabas. You think Barnabas was maybe a good choice for Paul? God has put people in your life to show you, to stretch you. Sometimes you're the John and you need help, and sometimes you're the Peter that needs to show your friend. And I don't think it's always Peter showing John. I don't think it's a husband always showing a wife or a wife always showing a husband. God has put you with certain people to help one another. And John, who on his own could not go in. It doesn't say that he was waiting for Peter. He stooped in. But he didn't go in. He didn't go in. He couldn't, for whatever reason, he couldn't go in. And yet, when Peter goes in, it almost encourages him. It gives him, listen, we should know that by our life. You can look at people and see that they've encouraged you to do stuff, right? I mean, your parents ever encourage you to do something? Spiritually, people have been put in your life. How big a deal was this? This is one of the craziest statements. I can't even fully explain it or understand it. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in. That's John. And he saw and what? He saw and believed. Not that he believed about Jesus, who he was and whatever, but look at what it says. For until then, they still hadn't understood the scriptures that said Jesus must what? And then they go where? They go home. They found out the information that God wanted them to find out, and they simply go what? The implication of this text is that when they were both in there, then the disciple who had reached went in and he saw and believed. So this is specific to John. That had John not gone in, 2 and 2 wouldn't have made 4 that day. Until that moment, he didn't understand the resurrection. But for whatever reason, when he went into that tomb, the resurrection made sense. Think how powerful a moment that is for Peter. Think how powerful that is for John. Now look, God can get John to understand. He's going to get John to understand because John's a pivotal player in all of this. But he uses Peter. And do you see how it's funny? Like the things we kind of would want to mold in people actually help. What I mean is, a lot of us would try and make Peter less rash, right? A lot of us would try and groom Peter to be a bit more put together. And yet, do you understand that if he didn't have that personality, if God had cleansed him from being kind of impetuous, his impetuousness made him jump out on the water that nobody else had the guts to do. And in this day, you know God doesn't put the same people together, right? Look at your husband and wife. There's strength and there's what? Weaknesses. And yet he uses both of them. If you're both like Peter, there's going to be an issue with that. And if you're both like John, there's going to be an issue with that. Stop trying to make people you. What the whole point is we're to become like Jesus. And this moment where Peter, like is used by God, the disciple reached the tomb, he saw and he believed. They hadn't understood until they still hadn't understood the scriptures. So he saw and believed, and then it says they. So it's him first and then Peter. They hadn't understood the scriptures that Jesus said, you must raise from the dead. I wonder how many times we've been the one stooping in and then the one running in. Go to John, verse 11, John 20. Mary has been with the angel. Mary has been to the tomb. She's freaked out. She is freaked out because the body is gone. She runs to tell Peter and John. Peter and John run to the tomb and go home. Where does Mary go? Mary goes right back to where? Right back to the tomb. Why? Because when she tells Peter and John the first time, it's not, hey, he's alive. It's they've taken his body and I don't know what they've done with it. She is not willing to what? She's not willing to go home. Peter and John are good. They go home because they've figured it out. Mary Magdalene can't go home yet because she's still what? She's still freaked out. She still doesn't understand. She needs to know. Part of what Mary Magdalene's plus side is, it would probably drive you mental, but she is the kind that just had to figure it out. She wouldn't give up easily. She had seen him die. She'd seen him put in the grave, but she knew. It's the same woman that was stood back at the cross, puzzling, pondering all of these things. She was a deep thinker. Listen, Mary Magdalene was a lady that 7 demons had come out of. So Jesus administered to her in a powerful way. She's part of how she provides for Jesus. And you got this amazing and this again, listen. God has prepared them. I'll see you in Galilee. Even before all of this. I'm going to be betrayed. It's okay. we don't know all of this, but do you think Jesus may have just pulled Mary Magdalene aside and said, it's going to be all right. It's going to be fine. She stands outside the tomb. Remember, she hasn't seen the angels yet. She's missed it. When she went to tell Peter and John, the angels show up to the other women. She's going to tell Peter and John scarper. They go home. Mary Magdalene comes back. Mary was standing outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she's weeping. And Jesus understands her heart. And Jesus, this is what I'm saying. God sees her. That's what we talked about on Sunday. The God who sees and the God who hears and the God who helps. And God is watching Mary. And it's an amazing thing that he appears to her first. That's got to mean something. The first person he appears to is Mary Magdalene. Remember, the others have just been told by angels that Jesus is alive. They haven't yet seen him. They will. She saw two white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been laying. The others saw him sitting on the stone. These angels now sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. A surreal moment. She stooped and she looked in. And when she looks in, she sees these angels. Again, there's this idea of she came back to the tomb. She looked in. She's investigating. And the more you investigate and the more you pour in, and the more, even though she's upset, she kept going forward. There's something to that. She didn't stop. She didn't say it's too much. She didn't go home. She kept searching for Jesus. And if you keep on keeping on crying, if you're upset, if you just keep searching, do you think Jesus is like, oh, whenever you really search for him, you know what he does? He shows up. And in verse 13, here's this poignant question again. Dear woman, why are you crying? The angels asked her. Why should she not be crying? I mean, it sounds crazy to say, don't cry. What would you say if you're Mary and someone says, why are you crying? Okay. I love Jesus. Right? Look at what she says, though. See, again, she should be crying maybe, but not tears of sadness. She should be crying great tears of what? Joy. It's exactly what you said. I don't know where you are, and I don't know what's happening, but I believe you. You said it. It's done, isn't it? It's done, Jesus. You're here, ain't you? You're here somewhere. Where are you? But look at what she says. They've taken away my Lord. She still doesn't really, she still thinks that what? Somebody has stolen Jesus. And I don't know where they've put him. Again, she keeps looking for a dead Jesus. She keeps thinking that this dead body would give her peace and hope and joy, and that dead body can't do any of it. And it makes me wonder how many things we search for and try and find, and it'll be the absolute mess of her. If she ever found a dead Jesus, it is utterly the worst thing that's ever happened to her. And yet that's what she wanted that day. I just want to see his body. You know the story, and I'll be through, we'll pray, we'll carry on next week, but this is really cool. This is God who sees and listens and responds. She turned to leave. She's there, she's come back, the angel speaks to her. All she says is, they've taken away, and she's ready to what? She's ready to leave. It's almost too much, too convicting, too hard. And she saw someone standing there. Just on time, just when you need him, just when she's about to, see, Jesus knows your breaking point. She's come back to the tomb, but the Bible says that she's about to what? She's about to leave. And just when it looks like it's over, who shows up? Resurrected Jesus. We don't know why she didn't recognize him. That's really not important. She didn't. Verse 15. Dear woman, why are you crying? Isn't that like God? You ever feel like God is asking you a question and you just want to go, Why is she going home? She doesn't really want to think about nor answer the question, why are you what? The angel's done asked her. She's turning around to go home. And what does Jesus come and straight ask her? Dear woman, why are you crying? Exactly the same thing. You ever had that happen to you? Oh, Jesus, I don't want to answer that. Oh, I'm sorry. God will keep asking you. He'll keep asking. And these questions are designed to get to the nuts and bolts of the spiritual root of things. Why are you crying? Because she's all kinds of emotional. And she hasn't, the real answer to that is, I haven't linked the resurrection with what you've said. I haven't fully put all the pieces together. Who are you looking for? Jesus asked her. You know, when we're fearful and when we don't understand, we say some crazy stuff. What in the world did the gardener want with Jesus' body? What does she say? She thinks it's a gardener and she says, hey, if you've taken him. Yeah. The gardener showed up with the angel, with the guards, with the sealed tomb and everything, and the earthquake and everything. And the gardener thought, this will be awesome. I'm just going to go in and steal his body and then stay around. That's how crazy we get when we get scared. We'll believe all kinds. It was easier for her to believe that this gardener had stolen Jesus' body than actually he'd done what he said. That's what we get like. We believe some silly stuff when we get scared, when we get emotional, when we don't understand. Sir, if you've taken him away, tell me where you've put him. And what does she want to do? And I'll go and get him. Man, if we understood what we were searching for as the last thing we needed, we'd be so far better off. Let me finish with this question for all of us. You ever thought one thing was going to make the difference in your life? You ever thought, if I just get there, everything will be fine? If I just get there. I know I'm not at peace now. I know I don't have joy now. I know I'm not a great Christian now, but if I could just get there, I'll be fine. And you know what really sets in depression and discouragement? The day you get there. And you know what you realize? Chasing things doesn't give me what? And you know what we do? Instead of saying that's a trap, don't fall for it again, you know what the devil does? He just sets what? Another one. Oh, it wasn't 1 million. It's 2. Oh, it's not 1 car. It's 3. So we chase and we chase and we chase. And we get the 3rd vehicle. And then we realize, And then he tells you, oh, no, it's not. It's a boat. It's a tractor. It's a... And we just... And I think some of it will look back at their lives saying, all I did was chase falsehood the whole time. When really, this understanding of Jesus and the resurrection and all of these other things are what should hold us and give us peace and joy. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts? If you want to know the napkin thing, go home and read it on the internet. I know Tasha was giving me the look, and I was like, oh, man. Isn't that what I said? Does anyone else have any